Good morning, everyone, and thank you, David, for the talk. I would say Al Gore got the inspiration train started on Tuesday night, and that train has left the station. Our next stop will be to hear a very inspiring panel on what companies are doing around the refugee crisis in the world. My name is Peter Nestor. I'm the Associate Director for Human Rights at BSR. I'm pinch hitting today for Margaret Young, who's our practice leader. She was unable to make it at the last minute, but was instrumental and very excited to put together this panel of speakers today. So I'm excited to engage them in some conversation, and then we'll have an opportunity to open it up for questions from everyone else. So very much looking forward excuse me, to the conversation today. Let me introduce our panel, and then I'll provide some context on the global refugee crisis, and then we'll get into the conversation. To my right is Neal Keny-Guyer. He is the CEO of MercyCorps. He's had a long and very distinguished career in the humanitarian field, working as the CEO for 2 decades. MercyCorps is one of the larger humanitarian organizations with over 5,000 people. They operate in over 40 countries and have been instrumental in creating business partnerships to handle a number of different humanitarian crises around the world. To Neal's right is Shamina Singh, the Executive Vice President of Sustainability at Mastercard and President of the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. So Shamina, I think we'll turn to you to bring this dual lens of both addressing this issue from a philanthropic standpoint, but also from the core business. You also have a long career in government, holding posts in the White House, U.S. House of Representatives, so it would be great to hear about the view from the government side in terms of public-private partnerships. And finally is Stephen Kaufer, the CEO of TripAdvisor. Delighted to have you here and welcome to the stage. Stephen founded TripAdvisor in 2000, and it has grown into the largest travel website in the world. And you may be asking yourself, why is TripAdvisor on a panel about refugees? But if you think about refugees as the most vulnerable but also unwilling travelers in the world, we can learn a lot, perhaps, from TripAdvisor about services, how do you get access to information, and how do you protect yourself along the way. We're very lucky to have the 3 of you here today. Thank you. Before we get started, let me just provide a little bit of context around the global refugee crisis, and it's very tempting to start and stop with the statistics. There are 65 million refugees around the world, including internally displaced people. And if you add that up, that means 1 out of every 113 people in the world are a refugee. But those are just the statistics, and I think it's very important to understand what the impact looks like behind the numbers. What does it mean to be that unlucky 1 person out of 113? And I think the best way to get at this is to take a human rights approach or a human rights lens. And when you study international human rights, they tell you there are 3 buckets of rights. The first bucket protects bodily integrity, your security, right? So the freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, the right to life itself. The second bucket protects rights around basic needs. Do you have access to food, water, shelter? And the third bucket protects rights around how you fit into the society that you are in. Do you have a right to vote? Do you experience discrimination? Do you have a right to privacy? Those kinds of issues. And what's really important, I think, to realize about the refugee crisis is that they don't fit into just one of those buckets. They're at risk of all of their rights being violated in each of those buckets. When they flee their countries, their lives are often in danger, impacting their bodily integrity in bucket 1. Once they arrive, they are immediately faced with uncertainty around where they will find food, where they will find water and shelter, and whether their family is safe or not. And then as they get settled into the communities, there's questions around whether or not they have a political voice at all, whether or not they're being discriminated against, and whether or not they even have the right to vote or know where they will be when they wake up the next day. In short, I don't think it's a stretch to say that refugees are perhaps the most vulnerable people in the world right now. They are forced into a situation where all of their rights are simultaneously undermined and threatened. Now, the question for today is, what can business do about this? What is business doing about this? Often we see this as a political situation, not directly linked to business in a way that things like child labor or land rights or privacy usually is, But it turns out, and I think as we'll learn today, that a lot can be done. So let's now turn to our speakers and hear a little bit more about what companies are doing. Neal, I'd like to start with you, if I could, to talk about some of the work that MercyCorps is doing with business partnerships and get a sense of what's happening on the ground on this issue.
Great. Well, thank you. And first of all, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. I don't know if anyone has told you yet, but you're a good-looking group, at least sitting from up here.
They hear it all the time.
Yeah, it doesn't look like that there was too much partying and socializing last night, but good morning. And, you know, thanks to everyone here for all you do to make our world better. It takes all of us, right, for sure. Peter, thanks for jumping in, and I'm particularly thrilled and honored to be here with two key partners and when representing two great companies, Mastercard and TripAdvisor. So Shamina and Steve, thank you. You know, maybe where I would want to start is just to kind of pick up a little bit on the context first. You know, if you look at the increase of people forced to flee their homes, there are about 20 people every minute that are forced to flee their homes because of violence and persecution. That means that by the time we end this panel, there'll roughly be 1,000 more people in that situation. And that gives you a sense of the scale and the magnitude and the importance of all of us to jump in around that. I think it's also important, as many of these refugee debates play out in the West, to recognize that the vast majority of people who are forced to flee their homes are living in countries close to where they had to flee from, right? So if you were to look at the countries that are hosting the largest number of people, you know, it's Turkey, it's Lebanon, and it's Uganda now, a little known fact because of the people who have fled. And those are, and in a country like Lebanon, 1 in 4 people are refugees. And so you again can see the burden that these frontline countries are sharing, not to diminish the politics of the West around this issue, but it's just to put that into some context. And I would say this is among the great challenging issues of our time. Not only the now 66 million people, but clearly the whole issue of migration driven by climate, as we saw, driven by conflict, will be on the agenda for all of us for years into the future. That's why this is so important. And as with every complex challenge anywhere, it has to be a multi-stakeholder solution, one in which government, business, civil society, social change organizations come together. So I think with that as context, and then, you know, clearly from where we sit as an international NGO, our partnerships with business are critical to so many of the solutions that we provide. I'll mention a couple quickly. I know that Mastercard and TripAdvisor will pick up on it, but I want to highlight, you know, one of the most important interventions that we did it in partnership with International Rescue Committee. It was supported initially by Google and others jumped on, was to create an app and a website, refugeeinfo.eu, that provided just-in-time information, you know, vital, relevant information in 5 different languages for people who were fleeing into the Mediterranean, into Turkey, into Greece, and then up into Europe. That was the first time that had been employed at that level of scale. And what enabled that, again, was both the combination of resources, but also the expertise of Google and the various other firms that they attracted. And it was great to do that in partnership with another great internet, you know, INGO on that front. I would say then if you moved it, we also partnered with Cisco to create the connectivity all along those routes. That was absolutely critical for us. It couldn't have been done without Cisco. And then I think all of you have heard of this big move toward cash as a substitute for stuff in terms of humanitarian assistance. Putting cash in the hands of people fleeing, one, it enhances their security and human rights, which is absolutely critical, particularly for women. But number 2, it gives them the dignified option of making their own decisions about what they need, and it's dramatically more efficient. The leader in that, and we're proud to be partnering, is Mastercard. In fact, a little bit of an advertisement. If some of you heard on NPR yesterday, there was a highlighting of some of the cards we're using in Puerto Rico with Mastercard, which really proud of. And then, so critical for us was a focus on adolescents. So, half of all people displaced are under the age of 18. A quarter of those are adolescents. Adolescents probably get less attention than any single group out there. And yet, in some ways, they're most critical for our future in the immediate sense. So in creating places where adolescents can get skills, can have service opportunities, can get on positive pathways, TripAdvisor partnered with us to help that happen in so many significant ways. So I just want to say thank you for that. And those are among the critical ways and why business partnerships are so important.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neal. Shamina.
I think the panel's done. I think. I'm glad to be here, and I'm especially fortunate because little known fact or anything. Okay, so you're basically my boss because I don't make a decision about anything without checking with TripAdvisor. So, you are my #1 resource for information on this. And Neal's my inspiration because I think that if you cut it, you can cut it both ways, right? We call them refugees, but in some respects, they're also immigrants, and that's very near and dear to my heart as a first-generation American. And so to the extent that I see the difference between an immigrant and a refugee is choice, and whether or not they decided on their own what to become. And so in that context, I think that it's an opportunity, but it's also a crisis of magnificent proportion. So to the extent that we are seeing the biggest migration since World War II, the world is moving. People are moving. And so when you are when you're in a position and when you have a company that operates in the space of the technology of movement, so but it would help to know what we are and what we aren't. So Mastercard is not a bank and it's not a credit card company. What it is, it's the technology, it's the rails that move money from point 1 to point 2, usually between buyers and sellers. So when Neal talks about cash, what he really means, I think, is digital cash. Yep. It's not physical cash. And so the work that we do to move, to take cash out of the refugee experience is really important. I'll say more about that in a second. But when you are in the business, if your technology is something that can move money from point A to point B and allow it to securely get stored in your account or in some other place, to the human rights point, it lifts your ability to own your own choices, right? So whether you're a refugee or an immigrant or a CEO or anything else, we all want to have our own choice about how we spend our money, the way we spend our money. So in a place that, especially for women, what we've noticed, and because of Neal, is that when women on the run in these refugee camps are given given a physical cash subsidy, think about what that means in terms of violence against women. Think of what that means against violence against children. But if you don't allow women to have access to that money, you're putting them back in a situation where they're not in control of what's going on in the next phase of their life. So I would just sort of ask to say, what I think about all the time is, how are we making sure that cash as a commodity, as a physical, how are we pulling that out of the system? Because it has a lot of negative implications for other things. Here's what we are not. So we are a technology company that basically connects buyers and sellers that can't see each other. And then the process of that really does allow dignity through choice. What we are not, we're not MercyCorps. We're not IRC. We're not subject matter experts on humanitarian and the experience of refugees. And so, so what we did, sort of even frankly before the refugee crisis started, frankly, thank God, was we asked Neal, we asked MercyCorps, and we asked about 10 other humanitarian aid organizations to come to Mastercard to say, tell us what we need to be doing to leverage our technology and leverage our expertise and leverage our money and leverage everything we have as a company to make this experience better and more effective for you as the experts on how to do this. And had we not had that conversation, I think it was probably 4 years ago now, we wouldn't have been in a position to partner, I think, so efficiently and so strongly with Neal and the organizations like MercyCorps to actually make a difference in what we're doing. We would have ended up, perfectly fine, sort of writing a check or sort of doing what anybody should do, and we do that too. But the real inspiration and the real difference comes when you can actually leverage your business expertise and the value of your business to make a difference, make things more efficient. And I think that was the trick, that was the place we were able to get to because we started this conversation with the experts very early. What's been the impact? Out of that conversation became, I'll just give one example, and then is what we're doing in Puerto Rico, which is displacing cash, pulling it out of the system so that people can transact in real time. And let me instead of going the other example, I'll build on this example. What we saw in Hurricane Irma, and I think what we're going to see in Puerto Rico, is, so these people are not, we don't call them refugees, but they are displaced because of a natural disaster. One of the things that we were doing with the data that comes when you digitize these transactions and this aid is we can tell by the data what gas stations are open and what are they selling. So one of the things that we kept hearing over and over again in Houston and everywhere else is long lines for gas, or where do we find milk, or where do we find water, or who's open, who isn't, who's out. By looking at the transactions, we couldn't tell who was doing it, but what we could see was they were being spent in certain places. We were able to work with a car company, I think General Motors, whoever does the OnStar on demand. We went to them and said, hey, if they hit OnStar, if they somehow get access to that, or you can tell them where to drive or where to go to get gas or get whatever they need. That was an amazing leap forward for these people who at that time were displaced. That's just one example, I think, of how technology and how things that you may not think about every day actually make a difference. And so, but we're just incredibly grateful to be part of it, and incredibly grateful for the partnership.
Very good. Thank you, Shamina. Stephen.
So TripAdvisor has a kind of long history of philanthropy, and we've done things to help drought situations in Africa or sanitation in Cambodia. And when we saw the pictures, read the stories of what was going on this crisis, collectively the company said, we just have to get involved. We have to act. And so I asked the team, and of course, like many others, we were able to write a check to help some great organizations like MercyCorps that have the feet on the ground, that know what to do. But I asked the team, what else could TripAdvisor specifically do because of who we are? And just as Mastercard is a fantastic example of being able to apply the technology and the expertise of the company, I wanted to figure out what that could be for our company. Well, what assets do we have? We don't have boots on the ground in any of these countries. We don't really know anything about helping folks individually unless they're looking for a place to stay, and that's not, well, that is very much what was going on, but not the type of service that we provided. So we said, well, wait a minute, we have over 100 million members. We have an ability to get a message out to people that are members of our site, and so that's what we did. We offered a matching grant to our community. Over 100 million emails went out saying, look at this crisis, see what you could do to help. We're there with you because we were all members of the global community. And within 2 days, we got $1.4 million raised on the backs of what this community would do for us, just by asking. And we thought, wow, how do you follow up on that? How do you actually take it to the next step with another program, another piece? And I just wanted to point that out as an example of how even a company like TripAdvisor, which really would have very little to do with the infrastructure of being able to help, can take something that is unique to a company and then step it forward. What else could a company do? Well, not unique to TripAdvisor, but hey, I was perfectly willing to put my name and our company's name on this effort. And so little distressed that some of my internet company social media peers were a lot less vocal on this crisis, but that wasn't going to stop TripAdvisor. That wasn't going to stop our efforts to hop on TV, for radio, not only to our members, but out there as much as we could in order to raise awareness and encourage my peers and kind of other major companies that might not have something technically to add at the moment, but could get on the bandwagon to help in the crisis.
All right, very good. Thank you all. Really appreciate hearing those examples. We can come back to them a little bit more. I want to shift the conversation slightly, and Stephen, maybe I'll stay with you on this point here. Obviously, the immigration and refugee crisis has been in the headlines. It's been a big issue for us in the United States. Are there risks of getting involved in this particular issue? Refugees are sometimes seen as coming in to take jobs or other scarce resources or that sort of thing. For a company that's looking to get involved in this particular issue, or how have you, kind of worked through some of the risks of doing this work?
Sure. So if you're going to go out with a particular message about a community, and this one certainly had been politicized by the time we got involved, you have to think, well, how many people are going to write in? How many people are going to call in and say, like I received, say things like, how dare you support those other people when people in our own country, in Massachusetts, where I live, are also suffering? And I politely responded to many of these emails, but I have to tell you, I got way more fan mail, way more people that would stop us in the halls at whatever conference, wherever we're at, saying, hey, I'm a TripAdvisor member, I love your site, and I really love that you've taken a public stance, that you've gone out of your way to help these poor people that are so in need of support at a time like this. So I can't, to this room, deny that there were some detractors, but where is the backbone of leadership if you're going to let a couple of distractors interfere or prevent or persuade you not to do something that can be just so incredibly beneficial? So yes, a tiny risk that could have been there. No, none whatsoever that we found having acted on our appropriate moral instinct.
Good, and I do think we should take a moment, and for Shamina as well, to applaud your courage in doing this and stepping up. And Shamina, as you were thinking about kind of getting involved in this issue with Mastercard, what were those conversations like in the consideration of what should we be careful about when we get in here, if any?
Well, I mean, like I said, we started it 4 years. I mean, we started it sort of before this actually became an issue, and I'm incredibly glad. And the reason we started the conversation is because, partly, I think, because of Neal's inspiration, in the sense that, in the end, I mean, in the beginning, if you're on the move, if you are a refugee, you're actually a net consumer in a market. And so, to the extent that purchasing power is something you bring when you come to a new country, just like an immigrant, just like anybody else. The idea that if we were able to help integrate them and assimilate people into economies more quickly and more seamlessly, they would start to become more productive members of their new society. And so what do countries want? They want to make sure that people can live, earn, work, and spend. And so to the extent that we wanted to make sure that as quickly as possible, we turned these, in some respects, people who were bringing money in from aid agencies, because they do get aid from different countries to come to these countries. I mean, obviously it's never enough, but there is a certain amount of money that does come along with things like TripAdvisor when you have to handle this crisis. And so what we were sort of looking at was, how do we make sure that instead of a model that says you have to go to certain vendors to buy your tents, your water, your this, your that, in certain amounts, how can we, is there a way we can make sure that we can get them into regular grocery stores so that they can shop using a Mastercard, just like anybody else? And what we're seeing, and this is what's also at Neal's inspiration, is we're also doing a study now to show what does that injection of capital look like in a marketplace to lift the standards for everybody. And it's something that we haven't been able to quantify, but now we will. And so I think to the extent that, my own view is I think volatility comes with government a lot of times, like that's sort of up and down. I think with private sector, what I've learned, having been in the public sector, is that actually multinationals do serve a purpose in bringing consistency and stability of support, purpose, and commerce. And when you have those types of things, you actually turn a problem into a solution.
Very good, thank you. Neal, any thoughts on just hurdles, barriers companies should be aware of?
Well, I think these folks are great examples of that, in some sense, enlightened business that believes in social responsibility and its role in that, would look at this, the challenge of global refugees, unprecedented since we've been keeping records, the challenge of migration. It's a challenge too big to not act on, and that leading companies are going to feel called to act on it in the right way. And it's so critical when a company like TripAdvisor says, sure, we can help in our individual ways, but maybe more powerfully, we can leverage our platform to influence our whole industry and how we think. And all the companies here have such huge platforms that can be leveraged, in ways that speak of the people who are classified as refugees or displaced people or migrants, but with dignity. With real dignity, but also mobilizing the industry. And then a company like Mastercard, and we get it, in a lot of the really fragile places around the world, in the Yemens of the world, probably not a lot of money to be made. And I give Mastercard a lot of credit for being willing to go in and test how their infrastructure and technology works for last mile solutions, even in places like Yemen. It just is incredible, because not everyone has the capacity to do that. And it is risky for a lot of companies. The markets sometimes aren't there. But there is an opportunity to test in some of the world's toughest places emerging technology, or the application of existing technology to new environments that is going to point the way toward future solutions. So that kind of willingness to lean into risk and willingness to leverage your whole platform, I think, are attributes of any great company.
I like that term, a willingness to lean into risk.
But just in terms of the Yemen bit, if I might just add, because I think that's actually, it's a wonderful point. The work that we're doing at Mastercard, it's doing well and doing good. So I run the non-commercial side of the shop. My colleague Tara Nathan, who couldn't be here today, runs the commercial side of the shop, and we work hand in glove. And the focus isn't to make enormous profit. The focus is to not lose money, because when these problems they're beyond hundreds of thousands, they're beyond millions, they're beyond billions, they're into the trillions of dollars. You cannot have solutions that rely exclusively on philanthropy. You have to have solutions that bring in a blended approach between public and private to achieve sustainable but equitable economic growth. So the goal isn't to make, and believe me, I don't think that Mastercard as a company is making a ton of money. The goal is to not lose money, because then it becomes a philanthropic only effort that ends when the money runs out. So Yemen, for example, was a technology approach that said, you know what? There's something called KYC. There's something called Know Your Customer that banks have to follow in order to allow money to move. So we said, is there a way to disrupt KYC in such a way that we could create a points-based system on how to deliver aid? So that's what we learned in Yemen, was we created something called MC Aid, which is a new product that says when you can't deliver on KYC, when you can't establish certain regulatory things, is there a way to shop using points instead of cash? And so we developed a technology that says I'm going to buy 3 bushels of corn, 2 things of water, and a tent or clothing, and it's going to get deducted from my debit card just like a cash. But in this instance, it's points. And so you still get out of the process of having to negotiate your blackmail, because what we learned was sometimes when people go into the marketplace, they'll take their paper voucher that says you're entitled to these 10 things. They'll go in, the vendor will take the paper voucher and say, well, I see you're entitled to 10 things. I'm just going to give you 2, but I'm going to keep your full voucher and trade it on the black market. And so by shifting out of that kind of mentality into a mentality that puts the person in the driver's seat with the money or the points or the ability to consume, It allows them to make choice and keep those things. But technology is a massive enabler. So there is very few things that we can't work on if we figure out creative, disruptive ways to get there.
Right, and how to use what businesses are good at doing, right? Their core products and core services, which I think is what's so incredible about what you've been able to do. I want to come back and just putting on our human rights lens again and looking at vulnerable populations within one of the most vulnerable populations. Often children and women are considered to be among those that are at more risk of having rights violated. The impacts are more negative. They have less recourse to remedy. How are businesses or how is MercyCorps kind of working to identify some of the more vulnerable people within the refugee community and deliver services, aid to them?
Great. I mean, any number of ways. I'll be brief because these folks have got some great examples as well. But when I pick up on what Shamina said, I do think digital cash. Yeah, and sometimes it has to be physical cash, and inside Syria, for example, today it's harder, not everywhere, or in parts of Puerto Rico, there's no electricity, and so none of the machines work. But the ability, particularly in women who are fleeing, who often get into horrific situations when they don't have the ability to control their choices, they don't have resources. And they become dependent on these groups, insidious groups that often get caught up into trafficking to other. And so part of being able to identify the most vulnerable early on, particularly young women, to be, one, to create safe spaces for them, which is critically important. Two, a lot of the way we track is using some of the big data and transactions that come from businesses. A lot of the tracking technology has been developed in the private sector and now being applied for use of identifying and creating safe spaces. Then the ability to get digital cash, because as Shamina alluded to, so what we have seen when you give physical cash is often the husband or the elder man will go, oh, we know you were paid today, give us your money. We know you have cash in hand, give us your money. And it has set up some really concerning situations for us. And then the third, and I just will point for us in particular as MercyCorps, there are a lot of groups that focus on really young children and up through primary school. And then a lot of us pick up when people become young adults. But that target of adolescent is a particularly vulnerable group. They're vulnerable because that's, as we all know, particularly us who've had teenage kids, but it is that time in life when people kind of make those decisions that are you on the pathway to thrive or on the pathway to dive. And that where you've got to have the right kind of interventions there as people are figuring out their own value systems and so forth. And we used to take that for granted as a relief and development community. And so, again, having a TripAdvisor realize how important that is and support us in those efforts has been really, really important in that, at least in terms of the work that we do. Mm.
Very good. Shamina, you've talked about working specifically with women and some of the specific vulnerabilities that they are subject to. Any other groups that you're looking at, or?
Well, I think, listen, if you target women, and you've gotten a long way there. I mean, think about who's actually in the refugee community, right? Usually, the male in the family has either been killed or so a lot of women and a lot of children are on their own, and so. When you operate in that kind of environment, I can't imagine the horrific experiences that they must be facing. And so, when a few of us heard these stories about what was happening to women around the aid environment and getting their aid and getting raped as soon as they got their aid, there's not a ton we can do, but I'm really glad to hear that Cecile's coming to talk later on today, because I think that's sort of it's an important piece about the connection between dominion over your body and dominion over your choices. And when you're in that situation, you lose the dignity of choice. So anything that we can do as companies, as public, as private sector people, to help elevate and increase women and children, the dignity of choice and the dignity of dominion over their person is a good thing to do.
Very good. Thanks, Stephen.
So MercyCorps had introduced us to something called the Melissa Project, which is a small outfit, had just started, I think, 2005, 2006, relatively recently, or 15, 16, sorry. And it's based in Athens, and they pull in women and children from the camps into a building, modest building, and provide that psychosocial support. They provide the safety, they provide the pieces of the education. It's English classes, it's some IT skills. It's kind of what you'd expect. Got a chance to visit and listen to some of those stories and see the smiles on the faces and see how if you look at this very vulnerable population and have the opportunity to step in and help, and this is one of the projects that we had helped fund, you can see so very clearly the impact that it has. And I can't sit here and say, wow, and that's kind of solving the problem, because this is a relatively small number out of the massive number of people that need the help. But we looked at that and we learned from it, and it helped direct some of our additional investment in the adolescent education space, in the psychosocial support. And I guess I'd like to add, for those to whom it may be relevant, I ended up in Athens because I was on vacation. And as CEO, I needed some break from work. I needed some time to relax. And Tali in the audience suggested that I stop by and visit this outfit. And I have to be honest, I was thinking, yeah, that doesn't sound like part of this vacation I had planned, but I'm in the neighborhood, literally, so let me go. And with some extra encouragement, I made it and brought several members of my family. It was incredible to have that time looking at these individuals, having a real conversation, not in an area that I know anything about, through the great work of MercyCorps and our organization that helped identify and do something. And so to the degree that I can offer the little bit of advice to those who have some connection with the CEOs or some of the other folks in your organization, to get them in any way, shape, or form up close and personal with whatever the philanthropic efforts are. It's kind of impossible, as much as I support the great work being done on climate change, to get up and close and personal to a smoggy day or something. But in our case, in this sort of example, yeah, it really can make a difference. And so I'd encourage you to urge your CEOs to go through the same type of experience that I recently did.
Yeah, very good. We've heard examples of that too, where there's kind of field trips going out to see particular communities or areas of high risk for a company, where when you can get the CEO out there, then that can really help just kind of make the switch. So very inspiring story there. I want to stay on this and just hear a little bit more from Shamina on this as well, in terms of how you built the business case for this. I mean, you talk about the phone call you made to MercyCorps 4 years ago. I imagine there's a number of people sitting in the audience thinking, yeah, this is important, we need to get involved, but it's never that easy, right? It often takes a CEO who is personally bought in, or another conversation, or another way, a method of getting the buy-in. Can you talk a little bit about, even 4 years ago, kind of how you convinced the business that this was critical and this was important?
So it's interesting, because we actually didn't convince, it came from our CEO. And so I think that's another thing, is if you can get if it comes from the CEO, things tend to move a little faster than if they don't come from the CEO. So Ajay Banga, when he first joined Mastercard and became CEO, said, an Ajay fan in the house, good. When he joined, he was very clear on a business case around expanding the amount of people in the world who operate digitally. And so he sort of saw what was coming on AI and the technology and the things like that, and he sort of said, look, my competition certainly are other payment companies, but the competition is cash. So he said, right today, 85% of transactions in the world are still done in cash. And so if you're a digital company in payments, there's a heck of a lot of running room if you are in the business of displacing cash. And so when he put on that lens, he actually made it a corporate objective, not a philanthropic objective, but literally a corporate objective to say, mission of the company, a world beyond cash. 3 of our 10 corporate objectives have to do with force for good, financial inclusion, and making sure that our partnerships with government and nonprofits and other organizations are equally as important as our partnerships with banks and other payment processors. So he elevated the partnership arrangements with public sector entities and people who were in the business of doing good. And so he made the connection and has forced the company to figure out how you do well as a company, because Mastercard's not suffering in terms of the stock if you've seen it lately, but how you do well and how you do good. And so I think from us, it was about when you change your business strategy, it opens up a whole new world, not only of business opportunity, but a whole new frame in terms of thinking. So I think that was sort of, because it came from him and that vision, and it ties so nicely to where we're going as a company. The leap, if you will, to immigration or refugee assistance, in some respects, it's a population of people we have to make sure are engaging in the formal economy wherever they may be.
Good. And Neal, you work with a number of different companies across industries. What are some of the common business case arguments you hear?
Yeah, again, and this group knows this much better than I do, but in terms of all the studies, I mean, the business case is, I think there's an incredible talent pool, particularly among millennials, who want to work for companies that stand for something more than just the immediate business. They want to feel there's a higher purpose that they're a part of, so it enhances talent. I think there are a whole range of customers out there that are going to make their own choices by not only the quality of the product, but also what does this company stand for? What are the perceived values of that? So I think there's tons of that out there. And then the third, I think, the business case, and again, I think big companies get it. You know, Shamina, you talked about it with Ajay, in that you look at these big trends that are happening that could disrupt the whole world, the increase in fragility, climate, and so forth. Well, it's really hard to operate a great business in a very fragile world. That's not good for any of us. So there's a strong business case to be made that where companies can make a difference on these big issues. And some of it is just standing up. I mean, I've been totally impressed. I think it made a huge difference on some of the big social issues to stand, to see hundreds of companies stand up against discrimination and for open borders. I think it's made a huge difference to see all the companies that have signed all these briefs against certain declarations that have come down from the current administration. I think it has made a huge difference when a Starbucks, for example, commits to hiring 10,000 refugees, or Chobani yogurt is so public in who they are and their values. That matters greatly in terms of addressing these issues.
Fantastic. Very good. Thank you. We've got a few minutes left here, and I'd like to open it up to anyone in the audience who might have a question. We've got mic runners back here. There's a hand right there. We'll take, yeah.
Hi.
And yeah, go ahead. Please introduce yourself and then where you're from.
Hi, sure. I'm Valerie from Cuba. Thank you so much for this and your incredible contributions. I'm just wondering what you're thinking about in terms of the host populations, because I know in the crisis, it puts a lot of pressure on the host populations as well. So just wondering if you're thinking about that in your interventions and what your perspective on that is.
Good, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, that's a great question. And obviously a lot of our effort is carried out in a Lebanon, in a Jordan, in these frontline countries that have taken in the most people. And it's both in a way that is holistic, so you absolutely have to make sure that the refugee population or the displaced population is not getting benefits greater than the host community. You have to look at it that way and ensure, and so it's education for all, it's services for all, particularly for the most vulnerable. And where you can, you have to make sure that the delivery of aid is not exacerbating any particular tension. So we, for example, have major programs, particularly in Jordan and Lebanon, and in Nigeria. I could go on, we don't have enough time, but in all of those areas, we have major programs that bring together leaders from all the various communities so that they work together, design. If it's safe places or an adolescent youth center, it's open to everyone. We're going to make sure the refugee population is there, but it's open to everyone. The whole community feels that ownership. If it's a place where women can come, all women can come in this, and because that's absolutely critical to be able to do. And then in terms of even what I would want to say again is to pick up, and you gave me a great example of this, is this, if you're really clever about, digital cash, and you've got strategy, intentional strategies designed to create financial inclusion, you can't do that if that's not helping everyone within that. And so a lot of work goes into advocacy so you can get legal identity for those who don't have it, but then everyone can plug in from that pathway from cash to full financial inclusion.
Very good. Shamina, Stephen, on this point?
Good.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you. Great question. Any others from the audience? I think I saw a couple of other hands.
And Kiva does great work.
Yeah, tell Prema we said hello.
Very good. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, Dorji Mundell from BSR. It's great to see two corporates with such engaged CEOs. Not every other CEO is quite so engaged on some of these big issues that don't seem directly related to their core business. I'd be really interested to hear kind of your thoughts on how you can engage in that CEO network and the board of director network to make the case and advocacy within that kind of peer group, because that could be really powerful in terms of the cascade effect that could trigger.
Very good. Yeah, we've seen some great work from the Consumer Goods Forum and other types of forums. Have you seen that also in this space?
Great. I think it's a great question because it's one I've also wrestled with given the number of other CEOs that I've been fortunate enough to have interactions with, and their positive feelings towards being more philanthropic, but just being too busy day to day to actually take actions. And so I guess the advice I try to follow, the advice I would share, is make it as personal as you can with whoever that CEO is. So if you're trying to recruit a particular CEO to the cause, who's actual personal friends with that individual who you can get to kind of lobby on your behalf to get the CEO's attention, to push it down in the org, to make it happen, because, this room alone represents so many different causes that I fully support, agree with, but I still have to kind of pick and choose. And on top of that, I really do have a really busy day job and lots of other things I lose sleep over. So getting my attention for something that has to compete with a lot of other valid causes, if it was a phone call from a friend or a big client or something, it's going to bump to the top of the list.
So one of the things that I've seen work in the things that we're doing is, people are motivated by different things. They're incentivized by personal, but I think that one of the ways that, at least for multinationals, has been partnership around you partner anyways because of your business acumen, right? So customer, vendor, things like that. You come together because there's a business reason to come together. In the same way, you can have the social impact reason that also has business values. So for example, we have a partnership with Unilever that, everybody loves Paul Pullman, but Paul Pullman saw the business advantage of making sure that his supply chain was digital because of the cash and the corruption within the supply chain and the leakage in what was happening in his own supply chain. So he saw the value to say, if my shop owners are financially included and are able to get credit, for example, or other things, they not only can increase their own business and livelihood, but at some point they might be able to buy more products, be they Unilever or anything else. And so I have found that there is usually always an intersection between doing well and doing good. Now, the trick is going to be, and it has been, to say, it may not yield the margins at this level, but you're not going to lose money. And that's the thing, I think, for any willing CEO to say, look, it's not something that you're going to get in trouble for for doing, but at the same time, it has to be something that's going to be sustainable, and ultimately, it's a longer term play. The other thing I would just say, and this has a little bit to do with TripAdvisor, although not directly, is I had a conversation this morning with Beulah. I don't know if she's still here, from the World African Wildlife Federation, and we just started talking. There she is. Hi, Beulah. We started talking about ecotourism, and I was saying, oh my God, Mastercard's brand is priceless. So blah blah blah, priceless. So. So I said, we've been talking to some of our customers, because every retail outlet on the planet is probably a Mastercard partner, right? And so I was saying, we've been noticing that some of our retail partners are really interested in creating ecotourism experiences for their customers. And can we work together to sort of say, can we come up with a priceless experience that would get the Wildlife Federation what they need in terms of preservation of animals and preservation of the ecosystem? Can we build wealth for the tourism operator and the shop owner and everything else that, just like here, every ecosystem around Huntington Beach is related to this conference center, I would imagine. Can we do the same thing for ecotourism and whatever, Sid's Bass Pro Shop, or what was that one, Christina? I can't remember, but there was another, but there are these, Walmart, whatever, but there are intersections that we can create that allow this doing well and doing good partnership that I think is really interesting. Fantastic. Not to put TripAdvisor on the spot, that we'd love to do an ecotourism partnership that gets African Wildlife Federation a priceless experience, but wouldn't that be fun?
But that's what this is all about. Very good. I think we'll take the conversation into our networking break, followed by some breakout sessions after that. But please join me in thanking our incredible panel this morning. Neal, Shamina, Stephen, thank you very much.